Nobody was laughing 6 months later when they were lining up outside her gate, begging for her number. But they were all laughing when Ilara raised her hand for the sick cow. The laughter wasn't quiet or polite. It was a loud, rolling wave of ridicule that filled the dusty air of the auction barn. It echoed off the corrugated metal walls and seemed to settle on her shoulders like a physical weight. She felt her cheeks burn, a hot flush of shame that crawled up her neck. The auctioneer, a man named Henderson, with a face like a weathered leather boot, paused his rhythmic chant. He squinted down at her from his podium, a smirk playing on his lips. He knew her, or rather, he knew of her. He knew her as the granddaughter of old Thomas Miller, the man who had once been a legend in these parts, but had died with a reputation for being an eccentric old fool. Henderson saw her as an extension of that foolishness. "Well, now," he drawled, his voice amplified by the crackling microphone. "We've got a bid, a brave bid, I might add." More laughter rippled through the crowd of seasoned farmers and ranchers. They were men with calloused hands and sun-creased eyes, men who understood the brutal calculus of livestock. They saw a walking loss, a bag of bones with dull eyes and a rattling cough that promised only vet bills and a shallow grave. Ilara kept her hand raised, her arm trembling slightly. She tried to fix her gaze on the miserable animal in the pen, not on the sea of mocking faces. The cow was a pathetic sight. Its ribs stood out in sharp relief against its hide, which was patchy and dull. Its head hung low, and a thin line of drool trickled from its mouth. It was the picture of defeat. Yet, in the way it held its head, in the unique curve of its horns that most would dismiss as deformity, Ilara saw something else. She saw her grandfather's sketches. She heard his voice in her memory, a low, rumbling murmur about a lost legacy. $20, Henderson announced, his tone dripping with amusement. "I've got $20 from the young lady. Do I hear 30? Or does anyone have the number for a good charity?" The joke landed perfectly. The barn erupted again, louder this time. Ilara felt a new, sharper sting of humiliation. It was one thing to be foolish, another to be the subject of a public joke. A powerful voice cut through the noise. "Let her have it, Henderson. Some people just like throwing good money after bad. It's a charity case, folks." The voice belonged to Caleb Vance. He stood near the front, leaning against a railing with the easy confidence of a man who owned half the county. He was handsome, successful, and cruel. His family's farm was the largest and most profitable, a corporate operation that had swallowed up smaller family farms, including a few that had once belonged to her own relatives. He looked directly at Ilara, his eyes cold and dismissive. He didn't just see a fool. He saw someone utterly insignificant. The phrase, "a charity case," hung in the air, sharp and venomous. It was designed to strip her of any dignity, to frame her bid not as a calculated risk, but as a pathetic act of misguided pity. She saw the other farmers nod in agreement, their amusement turning to a kind of smug pity. They were all in on it, a fraternity of pragmatists who had no room for sentiment or long shots. Ilara's jaw tightened. The shame was still there, a hot coal in her stomach. But something else was beginning to smolder alongside it. A cold, hard anger. She had come back to this town broken, hoping to find solace in the familiar landscapes of her childhood. Instead, she had found the same casual cruelty she had tried to escape. She had come home to heal, but the old wounds were being torn open and salted. "Going once," Henderson sang, eager to move on to more profitable animals. "Going twice." He didn't even look at her. He looked at Caleb, sharing a conspiratorial smirk. Ilara lowered her hand slowly. She met Caleb's gaze across the crowded room. His expression was one of pure condescension, as if he were watching a child make a terrible, predictable mistake. He gave a slight, dismissive shake of his head. The message was clear. You don't belong here. You don't know what you're doing. Sold! Henderson's gavel cracked down. To the young lady for $20. Good luck to you, ma'am. You're going to need it. He moved on instantly, his voice picking up its hypnotic rhythm for the next lot, a pen of healthy, bellowing steers. The attention of the crowd shifted with him. She was already forgotten. Her foolish purchase, a momentary diversion. Ilara felt a strange sense of calm settle over her as she walked toward the payment office. The laughter still echoed in her ears, and Caleb's words were branded onto her mind. A charity case. The anger was still there, but it was changing, crystallizing into something else. It was becoming fuel. They thought they were watching her fail. They had no idea they were watching her begin. She clutched the worn strap of her bag, the corner of a hard, leather-bound book inside pressing against her hip. It was her grandfather's journal, her secret weapon. They saw a sick cow. She saw a queen in disguise, and she knew, with a certainty that defied all the laughter and all the scorn, that she would be the one to restore her to the throne. The road ahead would be long and arduous, but the thought of the silence that would one day replace their laughter was a promise she made to herself. It was a promise she intended to keep. The drive back to her grandfather's dilapidated farm was quiet. The old truck rattled and groaned, its engine complaining with every shift of the gears. In the back, secured in a small, borrowed trailer, the cow stood silently, her breath making small puffs of steam in the cooling afternoon air. Ilara glanced in the rearview mirror, her eyes lingering on the animal's frail form. The purchase felt both insane and profoundly right. $20. The price of a few bags of feed, the price of public humiliation. She hoped it would be the best $20 she had ever spent. When she arrived, the farm looked even more desolate than she remembered. The paint on the old barn was peeling, and several shingles were missing from the roof of the farmhouse. Weeds choked the flower beds her grandmother had so lovingly tended. It was a place haunted by memories and neglect. She had returned a month ago, after her life in the city had spectacularly imploded. A failed business, a broken engagement, and a mountain of debt had sent her running back to the only place she had left. Her parents had sold off most of the land years ago, keeping only the original homestead, the house, the barn, and 10 acres of overgrown pasture. As a sort of sentimental anchor they rarely visited. They had been relieved when she'd offered to come and sort things out, a euphemism for hiding from the world. They didn't understand her connection to this place. For them, it was a relic. For Ilara, it was a sanctuary, the last place on earth where she had felt truly seen. That was because of her grandfather, Thomas Miller. Unlatching the trailer, she led the cow gently into the smaller of the 2 barns, the one her grandfather had called his infirmary. It was clean and dry, the floor thick with fresh straw she'd laid out that morning. The cow stumbled slightly, her legs weak, but she didn't resist. She moved with a weary resignation that broke Ilara's heart. Ilara filled a trough with fresh water and a small bucket with a specially prepared mash, oats, molasses, and a blend of herbs her grandfather had sworn by. The cow sniffed at it tentatively, then began to eat, slowly and without enthusiasm. Ilara leaned against the wooden stall, the scent of hay and old wood filling her senses. It was the smell of her childhood. She remembered tagging along with her grandfather, her small hand lost in his large, calloused one. He was a man out of time, even back then. While other farmers were chasing higher yields with new breeds and chemical fertilizers, her grandfather was obsessed with heritage lines and old ways. "The old blood knows how to survive, Ellie," he would say, his voice a low rumble. "It remembers the land. We just have to remember how to listen to it." The other farmers, including Caleb Vance's father, had called him a dinosaur. They'd laughed at his small herd of strange-looking cattle and his refusal to modernize. They'd pointed to their swelling bank accounts as proof of his folly. But her grandfather had never cared about the money. He cared about the legacy. He had been particularly fascinated by one breed, the Astoria Reds, a breed rumored to have come over with early settlers, perfectly adapted to the rocky soil and harsh winters of their region. They were known for their resilience, their rich milk, and their unique intelligence. But by the time Ilara was a girl, they were all but gone, bred out of existence in favor of larger, faster-growing commercial breeds. Her grandfather had spent the last 20 years of his life searching for any remaining trace of their bloodline. He traveled to remote farms, scoured old livestock records, and corresponded with breeders across the country. It became his magnificent obsession. Ilara walked back to the house, the evening light casting long shadows across the neglected yard. Inside, the air was stale. She had done little to make it her own, living amongst the ghosts of her grandparents' lives. On the kitchen table, next to a stack of unpaid bills, sat the leather journal. Its cover was worn smooth with use, the title embossed in faded gold. Bloodlines and Remedies. T. Miller. She opened it to a marked page. On the left was a detailed sketch of a cow's head, its horns having a distinctive lyre-like curve. On the right, in her grandfather's spidery handwriting, was a description. Astoria Red. Note the widow's peak swirl of hair between the eyes. Horns curve up and out, never back. Coat can range from deep mahogany to a washed-out rust, especially in times of poor health or stress. Prone to a respiratory ailment that mimics bovine pneumonia, but is, in fact, a stress-induced inflammation of the bronchial passages. Responds not to antibiotics, but to a tincture of elderflower and steamed mullein. Ilara's finger traced the sketch. It was her. The cow in the barn, the washed-out rust coat, the rattling cough, the precise curve of the horns. When she had first seen the animal listed in the auction catalog, described simply as mixed-breed female, age 4, poor condition, a flicker of an impossible hope had ignited within her. Seeing it in person, despite the miserable state it was in, had turned that flicker into a certainty. Everyone else saw a worthless mutt on death's door. She saw the ghost her grandfather had chased for 2 decades. The journal was his life's work. It was filled with genetic charts, dietary formulas, and observations gleaned from a lifetime of watching and listening to animals. It was a book of secrets. When he had given it to her, just a few weeks before he passed away, his hand had trembled. "Don't let them forget, Ellie," he had whispered, his voice thin as paper. "There's wisdom in the old ways. Don't let the noise of the modern world drown it out." She had been in college then, studying business, dreaming of a life in the city. She had taken the journal to be polite, a final indulgence of her beloved grandfather's eccentricities. She had packed it away, and in the rush of her new life, she had forgotten his words. It was only when that life had shattered, when she was left with nothing but the quiet hum of her own failure, that she had finally opened the book. And in its pages, she found not the ramblings of an old man, but a roadmap. That night, she made the tincture of elderflower and mullein, just as the journal described. The herbs grew wild along the creek bed at the edge of the property, exactly where her grandfather's hand-drawn map indicated they would. As she steamed the leaves, their earthy scent filled the small kitchen, and she felt a connection to him so strong it was almost a physical presence. She brought the warm, fragrant mixture to the barn. The cow, which she had decided to name Astoria, lifted her head as she approached. Her eyes, which had been so dull and lifeless, seemed to hold a flicker of curiosity. Ilara spoke to her softly, her voice a low murmur, just as her grandfather had taught her. She didn't try to force the remedy. She held the bucket out, and after a long moment, Astoria dipped her head and began to drink. Ilara stayed with her for a long time, watching the gentle rise and fall of her chest. The rattling sound of her breathing already seemed a little less harsh. Outside, the world was silent. The mocking laughter of the auction house felt a million miles away. Here, in the quiet dark of the old barn, with her grandfather's wisdom as her guide, Ilara felt a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just about saving a cow. It was about saving herself. It was about proving that her grandfather wasn't a fool, and that she wasn't a charity case. She was a miller, and a miller never gave up on a legacy. The first few weeks were a grueling test of faith. Astoria's recovery was not a miraculous, overnight transformation. It was a slow, painstaking process, a 2 steps forward, 1 step back dance with death. Ilara was up before dawn every morning, mixing special feeds according to the complex formulas in the journal. The book called for things the local feed store had never heard of: kelp meal for trace minerals, brewer's yeast for digestive health, a precise ratio of alfalfa and Timothy hay. She had to drive 2 hours to a specialty organic supplier, spending money she barely had. Her best friend, Sarah, who lived in the next town over, called her every few days, her voice a mixture of concern and skepticism. "Ellie, are you sure about this? My dad said that cow was a goner." He said Caleb Vance was telling everyone at the diner you'd be lucky to get a week out of her. "Caleb Vance can mind his own prize-winning pigs," Ilara snapped, more harshly than she intended. She immediately felt a pang of guilt. Sarah was only trying to help. "I'm sorry," Ilara sighed, sinking onto the porch steps, the phone pressed to her ear. "It's just, I'm so tired, and everyone here looks at me like I'm crazy." "Let them," Sarah said, her tone fiercely loyal. "They're the same people who thought your grandfather was nuts, and he was the smartest man I ever met. Does the book say she'll pull through?" "The book says she's resilient," Ilara replied, looking out at the overgrown pasture. "It says her kind can come back from the brink, as long as they have the right care. It's just hard to see the progress sometimes." There were days when Astoria wouldn't eat, days when her cough returned with a vengeance, leaving her trembling with exhaustion. On those days, doubt would creep in, a cold, insidious whisper in the back of Ilara's mind. What if they were right? What if she had just bought a dying animal out of some misguided sentimental fantasy? What if she was just as foolish as they all thought she was? On those days, she would force herself to walk the 10 acres of her property. She would follow the faint paths her grandfather had worn into the earth, his presence a comforting ghost at her side. She would find the wild herbs he had cultivated, the hardy apple trees he had grafted, the swale he had dug by hand to capture the rainwater. This land wasn't just dirt and weeds. It was a living testament to his philosophy. It was a system designed to support life, to nurture resilience. He had prepared this place, not for a commercial herd, but for something special. He had prepared it for a cow like Astoria. Bolstered by these walks, she would return to the journal. She read it not just for instructions, but for strength. His notes were meticulous. Day 12. Bronchial inflammation subsiding. Appetite improving. Introduced minced willow bark into her mash as a natural anti-inflammatory. She prefers it steeped in warm water. Ilara would follow the instructions to the letter, and more often than not, Astoria would respond. One morning, about a month after the auction, she walked into the barn and found Astoria standing not with her head hanging low, but with it held up, her ears pricked forward. Her coat, which had been so rough and dull, had started to gain a subtle sheen. The deep mahogany red her grandfather had described was beginning to emerge from beneath the washed-out rust. When Ilara approached, Astoria didn't just tolerate her presence. She turned her head and nudged Ilara's hand with her nose. Tears welled in Ilara's eyes. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a monumental victory. It was a sign of trust, of life returning. She wrapped her arms around the cow's neck, burying her face in the surprisingly soft hair. "We're going to make it," she whispered. "You and me. We're going to show them all." The progress became more steady after that. Astoria gained weight, her ribs disappearing under a healthy layer of flesh. Her breathing grew quiet and even. The light in her eyes brightened, revealing a calm and startling intelligence. She would watch Ilara with a knowing gaze, as if she understood everything. As Astoria's health improved, Ilara began to work on the farm itself. She spent her days clearing the pastures, mending fences, and patching the barn roof. The physical labor was exhausting, but it was also cleansing. With every swing of the hammer, with every weed she pulled, she felt like she was reclaiming not just the farm, but a piece of herself. She was no longer hiding. She was building. The outside world, however, had not forgotten her. One afternoon, Caleb Vance's gleaming new truck pulled into her driveway, spitting gravel. He got out and leaned against the door, his arms crossed over his chest. He wore expensive boots and a clean work shirt, looking more like a magazine model than a farmer. "Miller," he said, his voice carrying an easy arrogance. "I was just passing by. Heard you were still playing nursemaid to that bag of bones." Ilara's hands tightened on the fence post she was setting. She didn't turn to face him. "What do you want, Caleb?" "Just making sure you haven't gone completely bankrupt yet," he said with a chuckle. "My father and I have a bet, you see. He says you'll last 3 months. I was more generous. I said 6. Ilara straightened up slowly and turned to face him. Her clothes were stained with dirt and sweat. Her hair was a mess, but her eyes were clear and steady. "You should have saved your money." Caleb's smirk faltered for a second. He glanced past her, toward the barn. "So, is it still breathing?" "She's doing just fine," Ilara said, her voice cold. "She?" He scoffed. "You gave it a name? That's the first mistake of a sentimental farmer. You get attached, you lose perspective. It's a unit of production, Miller. Or in your case, a unit of loss." He pushed himself off the truck and started walking toward her. "Look, I'm not a complete monster. When that thing finally kicks the bucket, I'll do you a favor. I'll send one of my guys over with a backhoe to dig the hole. No charge. Consider it charity." He winked, throwing his own cruel word back at her. The anger that had been simmering inside her for weeks flared hot and bright. But she remembered her grandfather's other lesson. Never let a man with a loud voice and a shallow mind see your strategy. Let him think you're a fool right up until the moment you prove him wrong. So, Ilara just smiled. It was a small, tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Thanks for the offer, Caleb, but I won't be needing it." Her calm refusal seemed to unsettle him more than an angry outburst would have. He stared at her, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. He had come here expecting to see a defeated woman wallowing in her mistake. He found something else, something he couldn't quite categorize. He saw a resilience he hadn't anticipated. "Suit yourself," he muttered, turning back to his truck. "Don't come crying to me when you're selling off that junk heap of a barn for scrap." He got in, revved the engine unnecessarily loud, and sped away, leaving a cloud of dust and arrogance in his wake. Ilara watched him go, her heart pounding. The confrontation had shaken her, but it had also solidified her resolve. Caleb's visit was a reminder of what she was up against, a wall of prejudice and contempt. He saw her as a sentimental woman, an amateur playing a man's game. He couldn't conceive of a reality where she knew something he didn't. His arrogance was his weakness, and she would use it against him. She went back to the barn. Astoria was in the small paddock they had cleared for her, grazing peacefully in the afternoon sun. Her coat was now a deep, rich mahogany, glowing with health. She looked up as Ilara approached and let out a soft, low moo. It was a sound of contentment. Ilara reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, gnarled apple from one of her grandfather's trees. Astoria took it from her hand with a gentle swipe of her long, rough tongue. Looking at this beautiful, thriving animal, Ilara felt a surge of pride that was fierce and protective. This was her work. This was her grandfather's legacy, brought back to life. Caleb and the others could laugh all they wanted. They were laughing at a ghost, a shadow of the past. They had no idea that the ghost was about to step into the light. The county fair was in 2 months. It was the biggest livestock event of the year. It was Caleb's stage, the place where he showcased his prize-winning herd and cemented his dominance. This year, Ilara decided, the show would have a new star. The next 2 months were a whirlwind of focused activity. Ilara's life narrowed to 2 things: Astoria and the journal. She discovered another crucial detail in her grandfather's notes, a detail that made her heart pound with a new, thrilling possibility. He had believed the last of the Astoria Reds were not just in their region, but had been sold to a small, isolated farm in the mountains a generation ago. The farmer had died, and the herd was dispersed at a chaotic, undocumented auction. The very auction where the dealer who'd brought Astoria to her own town had likely picked her up. More importantly, her grandfather had written, "The Astoria line is known for its remarkable fertility. Even in a state of depleted health, a heifer's primary biological imperative is to continue the bloodline. It is not uncommon for them to be in the early, often undetectable stages of pregnancy when they appear at their weakest. The stress can mask all the typical signs." Ilara's breath caught in her throat. She had been so focused on saving Astoria's life that she hadn't considered the possibility of a new one. She began to watch the cow with a new intensity. She consulted the journal again, cross-referencing anatomical charts and notes on subtle behavioral changes. A slight swelling of the udder, a new placidness in her demeanor, a tendency to stand in a particular back-stretching posture. The signs were all there, so subtle that anyone without the journal would have missed them completely. A trip to the next town over, and a quiet consultation with an elderly veterinarian who had actually known her grandfather, confirmed it. He was a kind man with gentle hands and eyes that held no judgment. After a careful examination, he straightened up, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Well, I'll be," he said, shaking his head in wonder. "Your grandfather always did have a sixth sense for these things. She's pregnant, all right. I'd say about 5 months along. And healthy. The calf's heartbeat is as strong as a drum." Ilara felt a joy so pure and overwhelming that it almost brought her to her knees. It wasn't just one life she had saved. It was two. It was the future of an entire breed. The $20 charity case was about to deliver a priceless legacy. The knowledge of the calf changed everything. It was no longer just about vindication. It was about building a future. Her plan for the county fair became more audacious. It wasn't enough to show up with a healthy cow. She had to make an impact that no one could ignore. She spent her evenings poring over the journal, not for remedies, but for strategy. Her grandfather had been a shrewd man. Tucked into the back of the book was a section he had titled, "On the Folly of Pride." It was a collection of observations about his rivals, about the way men like Caleb Vance's father operated. "They value what is seen, not what is known," he wrote. "Their pride is their biggest blind spot. They cannot believe that a quiet man with old books could possess something more valuable than their newest tractor or their biggest bull. Use their blindness. Let them walk into the trap of their own making." Following his advice, Ilara began to build her trap. She called the county fair organizers and entered Astoria not into the general beef or dairy categories, but into a little-known, rarely used category: Heritage Breed Exhibition. It was a category so obscure that Caleb and the others wouldn't even notice it on the program. It was designed for showcasing rare breeds, not for competition. It was the perfect, unassuming stage. Next, she made a phone call that made her hands shake. She called the agricultural department at the state university. She asked for the head of the livestock genetics program, a renowned professor named Dr. Alistair Finch. Her grandfather had corresponded with him years ago, and his name was mentioned several times in the journal. Getting through to him was an ordeal, but Ilara was persistent. When she finally had him on the line, she took a deep breath. "Dr. Finch, my name is Ilara Miller. My grandfather was Thomas Miller. I believe you knew him." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Thomas Miller," Dr. Finch said, his voice warm with memory. "Of course, a brilliant man, a visionary. I was so sorry to hear of his passing. He was convinced he was on the verge of rediscovering the Astoria Red. I confess, I thought it was a beautiful but impossible dream." "I don't think it was impossible," Ilara said, her voice steady. "I think I've found one, and I'd like you to be the one to confirm it." She told him the story, the auction, the journal, the recovery, the pregnancy. She invited him to the county fair, not just as a spectator, but as a guest expert for the Heritage Breed Exhibition. She offered to pay him a consulting fee and cover all his expenses. To her astonishment, he agreed immediately, his academic curiosity overriding any skepticism. "If you are even half right, Miss Miller," he said, his voice buzzing with excitement, "this would be the genetic discovery of the decade. I wouldn't miss it for the world." The final piece of her plan was the most difficult. She had to endure the final weeks of scrutiny without revealing a hint of her triumph. The news of her entry into the fair had trickled out, and it was met with the expected derision. Caleb Vance made a point of finding her while she was at the feed store one day. "Heard you're taking your pet project to the fair," he said, blocking her path in the aisle. He had a couple of his cronies with him, and they were all smirking. "What category did you enter it in? Most expensive compost?" His friends snickered. Ilara simply looked at him. The old fear and shame were gone, replaced by a cold, pitying calm. He was so confident, so utterly blind. He was a caricature of arrogance, a man walking toward a cliff edge while admiring his own reflection. "It's the Heritage Breed Exhibition," she said quietly. Caleb threw his head back and laughed. "Heritage? Miller, that thing is a mutt. It has the heritage of a junkyard dog. You're going to be the laughingstock of the entire state." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Here's a tip for old time's sake. Don't show up. Save yourself the embarrassment. There's still time to back out." This was his final act of cruelty, dressed up as a kindness, the last turn of the knife. It was the moment her grandfather's journal had predicted, the moment the proud man offers false counsel, blinded by his own superiority. "Thanks for the advice, Caleb," Ilara said, her voice even. "But I think I'll take my chances." She walked away, leaving him standing there, shaking his head in mock sympathy. He thought he was winning. He thought he was in complete control. He had no idea that the game was already over, and he had lost before it even began. As she loaded her feed bags into her old truck, she allowed herself a small, secret smile. The trap was set. All she had to do now was wait for him to walk into it. The day of the county fair dawned bright and clear. The air buzzed with excitement, a chaotic symphony of carnival music, shouting vendors, and the bellowing of livestock. The fairgrounds were a sprawling maze of tents, arenas, and exhibition halls. For most people, it was a day of fun and entertainment. For the local farming community, it was the Super Bowl. Reputations were made and broken in the show rings. Ilara arrived early, her old truck and trailer looking conspicuously shabby next to the gleaming custom rigs of farmers like Caleb Vance. She unloaded Astoria into her designated stall in the Heritage Breed Pavilion. It was a quiet, out-of-the-way corner of the fairgrounds, just as she had hoped. Astoria, now in the final weeks of her pregnancy, was a vision of health. Her mahogany coat shone like polished wood. Her eyes were bright and alert. She stood with a regal calm, completely unfazed by the surrounding chaos. She was no longer a pathetic creature. She was a queen. Ilara hung a simple, hand-painted sign on the stall. Astoria, Miller Farm. There were no grand claims, no flashy posters. She wanted the cow to speak for herself. Dr. Finch arrived shortly after, a distinguished-looking man with silver hair and a kind face. He took one look at Astoria and stopped dead in his tracks. He walked slowly around her, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and disbelief. He didn't touch her at first. He just looked, referencing a small notebook he pulled from his pocket, which Ilara suspected contained notes from his correspondence with her grandfather. "The horns," he murmured, almost to himself. "The musculature of the neck. The widow's peak, it's perfect. It's exactly as Thomas described." He finally turned to Ilara, his professional composure gone, replaced by the pure joy of a scientist witnessing a miracle. "My dear girl," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've done it. You've truly done it." Throughout the morning, a few curious onlookers would wander through the Heritage Pavilion, giving Astoria a passing glance before moving on to the more spectacular displays of massive bulls and prize-winning sheep. Ilara saw some of the farmers from the auction. They would point, whisper to each other, and chuckle. The story of the charity cow had become a local legend, a cautionary tale about a sentimental fool. They saw a healthy-looking animal, yes, but to them, she was still just a mutt, polished up for a pointless show. The main event for the cattle community was the grand champion judging in the main arena, scheduled for 2 o'clock. Caleb Vance was the reigning champion, and everyone expected him to win again. His prize bull, a massive Charolais named Titan, was the talk of the fair. At 1:30, as scheduled, the judging for the Heritage Breed exhibition began. The judge was Dr. Finch. The exhibition consisted of him standing before a small crowd of about 20 people, mostly families and a few stray 4-H kids. Ilara led Astoria into the small, dusty ring. Dr. Finch began to speak, his voice amplified by a small, portable speaker system. He started by talking about the importance of genetic diversity and the tragedy of lost breeds. He spoke of his old friend, Thomas Miller, a man ahead of his time who had dedicated his life to preserving that diversity. As he spoke, Ilara noticed a change in the crowd. People walking by on their way to the main arena began to slow down, their curiosity piqued by the professor's eloquent speech. The small gathering began to grow. She saw the auctioneer Henderson at the back, a confused look on his face. Then she saw Caleb. He was walking toward the main arena, flanked by his father and a few associates, his face beaming with anticipated victory. He heard Dr. Finch's voice, saw Ilara in the ring with her cow, and stopped. An expression of amused contempt crossed his face. He nudged his father, pointing, clearly making a joke at her expense. He decided to stay and watch the final act of her public humiliation before his own coronation. It was exactly what Ilara had been counting on. Dr. Finch then turned his attention to Astoria. "What you see before you," he announced, his voice ringing with authority, "is not just a cow. It is a living piece of history. For decades, the Astoria Red was believed to be extinct, a casualty of the modern drive for agricultural uniformity. It was a breed perfectly adapted to this very region, a genetic marvel of resilience and quality." He walked over to Astoria, running a hand along her back. Thanks to the tireless research of the late Thomas Miller and the incredible dedication of his granddaughter, Ilara Miller, we now know that the Astoria Red is not extinct. This animal, purchased for a pittance at an auction where she was dismissed as worthless, is, in fact, a purebred Astoria Red. She is, to the best of our knowledge, the last one on Earth. A murmur went through the crowd. Caleb's smirk faltered. He exchanged a confused glance with his father. Dr. Finch wasn't finished. He held up a hand for silence. But the story does not end there. His voice dropped, creating a moment of dramatic tension. This magnificent animal is not just a survivor. She is a vessel for the future. I can confirm that she is pregnant, due to give birth in the coming weeks to what will be the first documented Astoria Red calf born in over 50 years. A collective gasp rippled through the now sizable crowd. The whispers turned into excited chatter. People were pushing forward, pulling out their phones to take pictures. The local news reporter, who had been on his way to cover Caleb's expected victory, hurried over, his cameraman in tow. And then came the moment of pure, devastating silence. Dr. Finch looked out at the audience, his gaze sweeping over the stunned faces of the farmers. He let the weight of his announcement settle. The silence was heavier than any sound. In that quiet, you could hear the gears turning in every farmer's head. The scorn was evaporating, replaced by a frantic, dawning realization. They hadn't been laughing at a fool. They had been laughing at a gold mine. Ilara looked past them all, her eyes finding Caleb. His face was a mask of disbelief. The confident, arrogant posture had vanished. He looked pale, his mouth slightly agape. He looked like a man who had just watched a lottery ticket he'd thrown in the trash turn out to be the grand prize winner. He stared at Astoria, then at Ilara. His eyes filled with a dawning horror. Dr. Finch delivered the final, crushing blow. A purebred, pregnant female of a rediscovered heritage breed is not just a biological curiosity, he said, his voice clear and precise. It is an asset of incalculable value. The genetic material from this one animal and her calf could be worth millions to the right breeding program. Miss Miller hasn't just saved a cow. She has resurrected a dynasty. The silence broke. The crowd erupted, not with laughter, but with a roar of astonishment and applause. The reporter was shouting questions. Flashbulbs were popping. A well-dressed man in a suit, the owner of a national genetics company, was already pushing his way through the crowd toward Ilara, his business card extended. In the midst of the chaos, Ilara's gaze remained locked on Caleb. He looked utterly broken. His victory in the main arena was now a hollow, meaningless sideshow. He had been publicly, completely, and irrevocably upstaged. He had built his identity on being the smartest, most successful man in the room. In one 10-minute speech, a quiet woman he had dismissed as a charity case had dismantled his entire world. He turned and stumbled away, his father trailing after him, his face ashen. He didn't look back. Ilara stood calmly by Astoria's side, one hand resting on the cow's warm, steady back. She felt a profound sense of peace wash over her. It wasn't a gloating, triumphant feeling. It was deeper than that. It was the quiet, solid satisfaction of a promise kept. She had honored her grandfather. She had trusted his wisdom, and she had, against all odds, won. The laughter had finally stopped, and in the silence that followed, her new life was just beginning. The immediate aftermath of the fair was a blur of motion and noise, a stark contrast to the quiet, solitary months that had preceded it. Ilara was no longer the town eccentric. She was a local celebrity. The man from the genetics company, Mr. Harrison, was relentless. He offered her a staggering sum for Astoria and her unborn calf on the spot, an amount that would have solved all her financial problems and then some. Ilara listened to his offer politely, the chaos of the crowd swirling around her. She saw the faces of the other farmers, the ones who had laughed. Their expressions were no longer mocking. They were a mixture of awe, envy, and a fawning, desperate respect. They were looking at her as if seeing her for the first time. She looked at Mr. Harrison, whose eyes gleamed with the cold calculus of profit. He didn't see Astoria. He saw genetic material. He saw a commodity to be exploited. He was, in his own way, no different from Caleb. "Thank you for the offer, Mr. Harrison," Ilara said, her voice clear and firm, easily cutting through the din. "But she's not for sale." Harrison was taken aback. "Not for sale? My dear, perhaps you don't understand the numbers we're talking about." "I understand them perfectly," Ilara interrupted gently. "This isn't about money. It's about a legacy. My grandfather didn't spend his life searching for this breed so it could be sold off to the highest bidder and locked away in a corporate lab. He wanted to see it live and thrive here, on this land." Her refusal, spoken so publicly, only added to her burgeoning legend. The local newspaper ran a front-page story the next day with the headline, "Local Woman Turns $20 Cow into Priceless Legacy, Rejects $1 million Offer." The article painted her as a hero, a guardian of history, a stark contrast to the corporate, profit-driven farming embodied by the Vance family. Caleb, as predicted, had won grand champion with his bull, Titan. But it was a hollow victory. His win was relegated to a small mention on page 6. The talk of the town, the state, and even the national agricultural community was the Astoria Red. Caleb had been rendered irrelevant on his own stage. A few days after the fair, Ilara was in the barn, settling Astoria for the night, when she heard a vehicle pull into the drive. It wasn't the aggressive roar of Caleb's truck, but a more hesitant, sputtering sound. She looked out to see the auctioneer, Henderson, climbing out of his old pickup. He stood by the door for a moment, twisting his hat in his hands, looking deeply uncomfortable. Ilara walked out to meet him. She didn't say anything, just waited. "Evening, Miss Miller," he mumbled, his eyes fixed on the gravel at his feet. I just came by to—" He trailed off, then took a deep breath. "I came by to apologize. What I said at the auction, what we all did, it was wrong. I was wrong. I was arrogant and ignorant." Your grandfather, he always saw things the rest of us didn't. Looks like he passed that right on down to you." He finally looked up at her, his face etched with genuine remorse. "I've been in this business for 40 years. I thought I knew cattle. You taught me, and everyone else, a lesson that day. A lesson in humility." He extended a hand. "I'd be honored to shake your hand." Ilara took his hand. It was a small moment, but it felt significant. The first crack in the wall of contempt. "Apology accepted, Mr. Henderson," she said. Henderson wasn't the only one. Over the next few weeks, a steady stream of visitors came to Miller Farm. Some were farmers, like Henderson, offering shamefaced apologies and asking for advice. Others were historians, researchers, and sustainable farming advocates, all eager to learn more about the Astoria Red. Ilara handled them all with a quiet grace and a firm resolve. She was building a coalition, not a customer base. One evening, she found a letter in her mailbox. It had no return address. The handwriting was shaky and unfamiliar. Inside, she found a short, typed note and a small, folded piece of paper. The note read, "He wouldn't want the men to lose their jobs. He was a proud man, but a good boss. This is all that's left." Unfolding the paper, Ilara saw it was a lien notice. A massive bank loan taken out by Vance Farms was being called in. They were on the verge of bankruptcy. Caleb had overextended, borrowing heavily to finance his expansion and his expensive prize-winning herd, all while commodity prices were falling. His arrogant facade was a cover for deep financial instability. The public humiliation at the fair had likely spooked his creditors. The man who had mocked her for her $20 purchase was about to lose everything. Ilara sat with the notice for a long time. A part of her felt a sharp, satisfying sting of karmic justice. But another part, a part that sounded like her grandfather, felt a pang of something else. Not pity for Caleb, but a sense of responsibility for the community. If Vance Farms went under, dozens of local people would lose their jobs. The land would likely be snapped up by an even larger, out-of-state corporation. She thought of her grandfather's journal, of the passage about the folly of pride, and she thought of another passage, one she had read many times. "A true stockman builds a herd, but a true leader builds a community. The health of one is tied to the health of all." She made a series of phone calls, not to banks or lawyers, but to a small consortium of organic farmers she had met since the fair, and to Dr. Finch at the university. She used the credibility she had earned to propose a radical idea: a cooperative. A week later, a meeting was held at the local Grange Hall. Ilara stood before a group of small-scale farmers, the same ones who had once been pushed to the brink by Vance Farms. She laid out her plan: to form a cooperative that would purchase the Vance property out of bankruptcy. They would transition the land to sustainable, multi-use agriculture. They would keep the current employees on. And the centerpiece of it all, the financial and symbolic heart of the new venture, would be the Miller Farm Astoria Red Breeding Program. Her farm would provide the elite genetics, and the cooperative members would raise the crossbred offspring, creating a premium, branded product, Astoria beef and dairy, known for its quality and ethical origins. They would be partners, not competitors. It was an audacious, almost impossible plan. But Ilara, standing before them, was no longer the timid girl from the auction. She was a leader. She spoke with the quiet authority of her grandfather, armed with the undeniable proof of her success. She had done the impossible once. They believed she could do it again. In the end, with a loan from a forward-thinking agricultural credit union secured by Dr. Finch's endorsement and the proven value of her herd, the cooperative succeeded. They bought Vance Farms for pennies on the dollar. Ilara never saw Caleb again. She heard he had left town the day the sale was finalized, his gleaming truck packed with whatever he had left. There was no grand confrontation, no final, satisfying exchange. His ruin was as quiet and absolute as her victory had been public. She had not only beaten him, she had erased him and replaced his toxic legacy with something better. In a small act of compassion, she ensured that the severance package for the Vance farmhands was protected during the bankruptcy proceedings, a detail no one but the workers ever knew about. It was her one, quiet act of mercy. A few weeks later, in the quiet dark of the barn, Astoria finally gave birth. It was a small, perfect heifer, a perfect miniature of her mother, with the same lyre-shaped horns and widow's peak. Ilara sat in the hay, watching the new mother lick her calf clean, and she felt a sense of completion so profound it brought tears to her eyes. She had named the calf Hope. Late that night, she opened her grandfather's journal one last time. Tucked into a hidden pocket in the back cover was a sealed envelope she had never seen before. On the front, in his familiar script, it said, "For Ilara, when you've found her." Her hands trembled as she opened it. The letter inside was short. "My dearest Ellie," it read. "If you are reading this, it means you did what I could not. You didn't just find the cow. You found the courage to trust my words over the world's laughter. That courage was the real legacy I wanted to leave you. The cattle are just bone and hide. The wisdom is forever. Be proud of the home you've rebuilt and the future you've grown. Your loving grandfather, Thomas." The story was over. The victory was complete. And holding that letter, with the soft sounds of a mother and her new baby in the background, Ilara finally, truly felt like she was home. A year passed. The farm, once a symbol of neglect, was now a beacon of life. The peeling paint on the barn was covered with a fresh coat of deep red. The farmhouse was bright and welcoming, its windowsills filled with flowers. The pastures, once choked with weeds, were now lush and green, dotted with the growing herd of Astoria Reds and their valuable crossbred offspring. Miller Farm had become the heart of the new agricultural cooperative, which was thriving beyond anyone's wildest expectations. The Astoria brand beef and dairy products had become a sensation, sought after by high-end restaurants and organic markets across the state. The story behind the brand, the story of Ilara, her grandfather, and the $20 cow, was its greatest marketing tool. It was a story of resilience, heritage, and the triumph of quiet wisdom over loud arrogance. Ilara was no longer just a farmer. She was the CEO of a successful enterprise. Her days were filled with meetings, strategic planning, and managing the complex genetics program that was now the core of her business. The farmers who had once laughed at her now came to her for guidance. They were her partners. They were begging for her number not to mock her, but to get on the waiting list for the next generation of Astoria calves. The waiting list was 3 years long. She had turned her grandfather's 10 acres into the most valuable plot of land in the county, not because of what was under it, but because of what was on it. She established the Thomas Miller Grant, a scholarship for young agricultural students who wanted to study heritage breeds and sustainable farming, ensuring his legacy would extend far beyond her own farm. Her life was full and busy, but it was not lonely. One afternoon, a young veterinarian named Liam came by to do a routine health check on the herd. He had been recommended by the old vet who had first confirmed Astoria's pregnancy. Unlike the other men in the valley, Liam's eyes held no memory of the auction, no lingering shadow of her past humiliation. He saw her simply as she was now, a brilliant, successful woman running a remarkable operation. He wasn't impressed by the money or the fame. He was impressed by her methods, He was fascinated by the journal, which she shared with him freely. He would spend hours talking with her about herbal remedies and the nuances of animal behavior. He admired her strength, but he also saw the quiet, gentle soul that had driven her to save a dying animal in the first place. He respected her knowledge and valued her heart. Their conversations over hay bales and fence posts slowly turned into dinners on her farmhouse porch, watching the fireflies dance over the pastures. With him, Ilara found a partnership that was easy and supportive, built on mutual respect and shared values. It was a quiet, steady love, as resilient and true as the land itself. One evening, as they sat on the porch, Liam looked out at the herd grazing peacefully in the twilight. Astoria, now the grand dame of the farm, stood watching over her daughter and her new granddaughter. "It's amazing what you've built," Liam said softly, his hand finding hers. "From one sick cow that everyone had given up on?" Ilara followed his gaze. She thought of the journey, the laughter, the doubt, the struggle, and the ultimate quiet triumph. She thought of Caleb Vance. She had heard a rumor that he was working a menial job in a different state, a broken man living in obscurity. His name was a forgotten footnote in a story that was now hers to write. His downfall was complete, his memory erased by the thriving life that had grown in the space he once dominated. She felt no hatred for him anymore, no lingering anger. She felt only a distant, clinical pity. He was a prisoner of his own narrow worldview, a man who could only see value in what was already proven. He lacked the imagination to see potential, the courage to believe in the unseen. "Everyone was wrong about her," Ilara said, her voice filled with a peaceful certainty. "They saw weakness and disease, but my grandfather taught me to look deeper. He taught me that sometimes the most valuable things don't advertise their worth. They don't shout, they wait. They wait for someone who knows how to listen." She leaned her head on Liam's shoulder, a sense of profound contentment washing over her. She had come back to this place broken and lost, a charity case in her own mind. She had found her purpose in a book of old secrets and the life of a single, forgotten animal. She had learned that true strength wasn't about being the loudest voice in the room, but about having the quiet conviction to trust what you know, especially when no one else does. It was a lesson that had rebuilt her farm, revitalized a community, and healed her own heart. She was living the life she had truly earned, a life more rich and beautiful than she had ever dared to imagine. She had finally stopped accepting disrespect and started cultivating her own worth.